He took the bullet meant for the alien queen, then her order changed humanity's fate. The rifle was already up before anyone in the atrium noticed the man carrying it. That was the detail that would be replayed 1,000 times in the weeks that followed. Not the shot itself, but the 7 seconds before it, when 100 people stood close enough to stop a killer and not one of them saw him raise his arm. Later, analysts would call it a failure of attention. Marcus Chen, who had spent that morning wishing he were anywhere else on the station, would call it luck. Bad luck for the man who pulled the trigger. Good luck in a shape nobody could have predicted for the rest of the human race. But that came later. First, there was the waiting. Marcus had been on Outpost Meridian for 11 days, and in that time he had come to understand exactly one thing about his new assignment. Nobody wanted him there, least of all himself. He had been a field medic once, good enough that his unit called him Patch and meant it as praise. Then came the Holloway extraction, a decision made in 9 seconds that could not be unmade in 9 years, and the review board that followed had not been interested in his reasons. They gave him 2 options: discharge or reassignment to the Diplomatic Corps' most irrelevant posting. Perimeter security on a listening station most of the fleet had forgotten existed. He chose the posting because starting over somewhere new felt marginally less humiliating than going home to explain why he wasn't a medic anymore. Meridian sat at the edge of contested space, a squat gray ring of a station whose only real purpose was to host the kind of conversations both sides wanted deniability for. When word came down that the Vashti Empire had requested it as neutral ground for a delegation, the station's skeleton crew of 41 people had exactly 6 days to prepare for the arrival of beings that, until that point, had existed mostly as gun camera footage and casualty reports. Marcus had seen the footage. Everyone had. The Vashti were tall, chitin-plated, moved in ways that made human eyes flinch even when there was no threat attached to the movement. 3 years earlier they had annihilated 2 colony ships in the Persephone corridor without so much as a formal declaration. The peace, such as it was, existed because humanity had nothing left to lose by asking for one, and the Vashti, for reasons nobody in the briefings could adequately explain, had said yes. "They're not here to make friends," said Colonel Aditi Rao, station commander, during the final briefing. She was a compact woman with the flat, unhurried voice of someone who had delivered a great many warnings that turned out to matter. "They're here to tell us the terms of our surrender. Full annexation, partial autonomy, or continued hostilities. Our job is to keep this station from becoming the reason they choose the third option." Marcus, standing at the back of the room in a uniform that still smelled like the quartermaster's plastic wrap, had raised his hand only because nobody else was going to ask the obvious question. "What happens to us if they pick number 3? Rao had looked at him for a long moment. "Then it won't matter what any of us were doing when it started." That was the last full sentence anyone said to him before the delegation's shuttle appeared on the long-range scope. For days later, trailing an escort of 6 warships that could have turned Meridian into vapor without slowing down. The Vashti Queen Regent was smaller than Marcus expected, and somehow that made her more frightening, not less. Her name, translated as closely as the station's linguistics officer could manage, was Cithras. She stood perhaps 5.5 feet, her carapace a deep, oil-slick green that shifted color faintly with the light, for secondary limbs folded flat against her thorax in what the Vashti attaché called a gesture of formal restraint. Her eyes, 6 of them, arranged in 2 vertical rows, tracked independently, so that she seemed to be looking at everyone in a room and no one in particular, all at once. She came aboard with an honor guard of 8 soldiers and 2 advisors, and the moment she crossed the threshold into Meridian's atrium, Marcus felt the room's temperature change, though nothing on the environmental display moved. He had been assigned to the outer security ring for the reception, a job description that amounted to standing near a wall and trying not to look like he wanted to be somewhere else. He was not supposed to be close enough to hear anything. He was not supposed to be close enough to matter. He watched Cithras move through the receiving line with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had already decided how the conversation would end and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. Colonel Rao spoke first, formal and careful, and the Vashti advisor beside Cithras translated in a voice modulated to sound almost human, almost warm, and somehow worse for the effort. "The matriarch acknowledges your hospitality," the advisor said. "Terms will be presented tomorrow at the 9th hour. Tonight, she wishes only to observe." Observe what, Marcus wondered, and did not ask. He noticed the man near the east archway only because the man was doing something almost nobody else in the atrium was doing. Standing still. Everyone else drifted, murmured, angled themselves toward the queen the way iron filings bend toward a magnet. This man stood with his back nearly against the wall, hands in his jacket pockets, watching Cythrus the way a sniper watches a target, which Marcus would understand exactly 4 seconds too late, was precisely what he was doing. His name, they would learn afterward, was Gregor Alden Voss, a maintenance contractor who had been on Meridian's roster for 2 years, a man with an unremarkable service record and a brother who had died on one of the Persephone colony ships. Nobody had flagged him. Nobody had reason to. Grief did not show up on a background check. Marcus saw him reach into his jacket the same instant the rifle came up, not drawn from a holster, but assembled, a compact frame he must have carried in pieces through security scans calibrated to catch weapons, not components. There was no time to shout a warning that would have meant anything. There was no time to think about the 11 days he'd spent hating this posting, or the 9 seconds on Holloway that had put him here, or the fact that he had never, in 3 years of service, actually saved anyone's life in a way that counted. There was only the shape of the queen 60 feet away, and the shape of the rifle 4 feet away, and the short, dumb, animal certainty that someone standing this close should not let this happen. Marcus ran. He would not remember making the decision. He would remember only the sequence afterward, replayed so many times in his own head that it stopped feeling like memory and started feeling like something that had happened to somebody else. He remembered the 2 Vashti soldiers nearest Cythrus beginning to turn, too slow, their reflexes calibrated to threats that announced themselves differently than a concealed rifle in a crowd of unarmed diplomats. He remembered the advisor's mouth opening on a word that never finished. He remembered closing the last 10 feet in a stride that felt endless and instant at once, and throwing himself not at Voss, not at the weapon, but into the empty air between the muzzle and the queen, because there was no time to disarm a man, only time to become an obstacle. The round took him high in the chest, just beneath the collarbone, and the impact spun him half around before he hit the floor. He did not, in that moment, feel pain so much as absence, a sudden and total silence where a part of his body used to be. What he remembered most clearly, stranger than the pain that arrived seconds later in a flood, was the sound the room made. Not screaming, something quieter and worse. 41 humans and 11 Vashti going utterly still, as if the universe itself had paused to determine what came next. Then the room exploded into motion. The 2 Vashti soldiers had Voss on the ground before he could chamber a second round, one boot heel driving down between his shoulder blades with a precision that suggested restraint had never been the plan. Colonel Rao was shouting for medics, and somewhere above him, blurred at the edges of a vision going gray, Marcus saw 6 black eyes looking down at him with an expression his human brain had no reference for. Cythrus knelt. It was later considered the single most reported detail of the entire incident. More than the assassination attempt itself, more than the treaty that followed. A reigning matriarch of the Vashti Empire, in front of her own honor guard, in front of a species she had arrived to judge, knelt on a human station floor beside a bleeding stranger. "Why?" she said, in her own language, and the words came through the translator flat and strange, stripped of whatever weight they carried in the original. "Why did you do this?" Marcus, who was by that point mostly aware of the ceiling and the sound of his own blood in his ears, did not answer. He was already losing consciousness and would not wake for 2 days, by which point the question Cythrus had asked him would have already reshaped the fate of his entire species, though not one person on Meridian yet understood that it had. The Vashti medics reached him before the human ones did. That detail, too, would matter later, though nobody understood why in the moment. Only that a species with no obligation to save a human life had spent their own resources, their own advanced trauma technology, keeping one alive. Colonel Rao spent the following 40 hours in a state that her staff would later describe carefully as managed panic. An assassination attempt on a foreign head of state on neutral ground under Meridian's flag was precisely the kind of incident that could turn a fragile peace into the excuse a stronger power needed to stop pretending peace had ever been on the table. She drafted 3 separate formal apologies. She authorized a full investigation into Voss's record, his access clearances, the security failure that let him carry a disassembled rifle through 3 separate checkpoints. She prepared, privately, for the 9th-hour meeting to be cancelled, or worse, replaced by a very different kind of announcement. None of it happened the way she expected. Sithris did not withdraw to her ship. She did not demand blood, or reparations, or the immediate departure of every human from the station. Instead, she requested, not demanded, requested, a distinction the translator was careful to preserve, access to the station's medical bay so that she might observe the human called Marcus Chun while he remained unconscious. Rao granted it because refusing seemed more dangerous than allowing it. What she did not expect was that Sithris would return the next day, and the one after that, and that on the second day, when Marcus's vitals steadied enough that the attending physician allowed a short window of visitation. The Queen Regent of the Vashti Empire would be standing at his bedside when he opened his eyes. He did not, in that first disoriented minute, understand what he was looking at. 6 eyes, chitin catching the low light in slow color shifts. A presence that filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. "You are awake," Sithris said, through a translator unit clipped near her mandibles. Smaller, more personal than the formal apparatus from the reception. Marcus tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. "Where's?" His throat was raw. "Is everyone?" "No one else was harmed," Sithris said. "The one who fired is contained. You are the only casualty of the attempt on my life." Marcus let that settle, along with the throb radiating from his shoulder. "Good," he said, which was not eloquent but was true. Sithris tilted her head, a gesture he would learn, that among the Vashti signified something closer to recalibration than curiosity. "I have asked this question of your commander, your physicians, and your records, and none of them can answer it satisfactorily. So I will ask you directly, since you are now capable of speech. Why did you do this?" It was the same question from the atrium floor, and Marcus found he still didn't have a clean answer for it. "I don't know," he admitted. "I saw the gun. I didn't think about it." "That is not an answer. It is an evasion of one." "It's the truth, though." He shifted, wincing. "There wasn't time to think. There was just, you were closer to the gun than anyone who could stop it, and I was closer than anyone who could get in front of it. That's it. That's the whole reason. You had no relationship to me, no obligation. No genetic or social benefit could accrue to you from my survival. Your own commanding officer described our species, in briefing documents I was permitted to review as part of the incident inquiry, as an existential threat to your own." The 6 eyes did not blink because they could not, but something in their focus sharpened. "And you interposed your body between my death and its cause without calculation. I require you to help me understand this, because I cannot categorize it, and I do not trust conclusions I cannot categorize." Marcus, lying in a hospital bed with a hole recently closed in his shoulder, found himself laughing softly at the absurdity of being cross-examined on ethics by an alien monarch less than 72 hours after nearly dying for her. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I want to be really clear about that because I think you're building me into something I'm not. 3 years ago I made a call in the field that got a man killed instead of 2. I've been trying to live that down ever since. This wasn't noble. It was just the only thing I could do that felt like it wasn't doing nothing." Sithris was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, it was slower, as if she were choosing each translated word with unusual care. "Among my people, no individual acts without the consensus of the hive mind's weighted judgment. Even I do not act purely alone. My choices are shaped by 10,000 years of aggregated instinct that tells me, before I have finished a thought, what the correct action is likely to be. We do not have a word, in any dialect I know, for what you describe. A single mind, overriding its own survival instinct, for a stranger, for no gain, in less time than it takes to complete a breath." "Sounds like you're describing an accident with extra steps," Marcus said. "I am describing," Sithris said, "the reason I have not yet given my council the order they are expecting." The 9th-hour meeting had come and gone twice by the time Sithris finally convened it. First delayed by the incident itself, then delayed again, without explanation, by the Queen Regent's own request. Colonel Rao, forced to explain the second delay to a nervous chain of command back on Earth, had very little to offer beyond the fact that the alien monarch who had nearly been assassinated on her station seemed to be spending an unusual amount of time at the bedside of the man who'd saved her. When the meeting finally happened, it did not go the way anyone, human or Vashti, had prepared for. The delegation chamber on Meridian was a plain gray room built for exactly this kind of conversation. A long table, a scattering of chairs designed to accommodate both human and Vashti anatomy, walls bare of anything that might be construed as a symbol favoring one side. Colonel Rao sat at the head of the human delegation. Sithris sat opposite, flanked by her 2 advisors, her honor guard reduced from 8 to 2. A detail Rao noted with quiet, cautious hope. Marcus was not present. He was still recovering, still confined to the medical bay, unaware that the outcome of the next 20 minutes would be attributed, in every history written afterward, primarily to him. "I have reviewed the terms my Hive Council prepared prior to our arrival," Sithris said, once the formalities had been observed. Full annexation of human territory, administered under Vashti governance, with human military and industrial capacity absorbed into imperial structure within one standard cycle. This was the recommendation given the data available to us. A species with insufficient technological parity, insufficient political cohesion, and a demonstrated pattern of internal conflict that the Council interpreted as instability requiring external correction. Rao's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. There was nothing yet to say. "I am not going to submit that recommendation," Sithris continued. The room did not move. Rao would later say it was the longest silence of her career, and she had sat through worse things than silence. 3 days ago, Sithris said, an individual with no Vashti heritage, no obligation to me, and every documented reason to view my presence as a threat, chose to place his body between mine and a weapon, in a fraction of a second, without instruction, without precedent, without benefit to himself. I have spent the days since attempting to determine whether this was an aberration, a single unusual mind among a species otherwise as the data suggested, or whether it represents something my council's models failed to account for. She paused, and one of her advisors shifted almost imperceptibly, as if bracing for what came next. "I do not yet know the answer with certainty, but I know this: no calculation my people have run, across 10 millennia of consensus-governed civilization, produces behavior like this. We do not have individuals who act against the weighted judgment of survival for strangers. We have never needed to because our decisions are made collectively, and the collective does not sacrifice itself for outliers. Your species appears, on the evidence of one man in one atrium, to produce such individuals as a matter of course, unpredictably, without warning, without the coordination that would make it a tactic rather than a trait. You're saying," Rao said carefully, testing the ground, "that our unpredictability is the reason you're not annexing us. I am saying that a species capable of producing behavior my models cannot forecast is not a species that should be absorbed into a structure built entirely on the assumption that behavior can be forecast." Sithris's eyes tracked slowly across the human side of the table. "It is also a species I believe my empire cannot afford to make an enemy of, and cannot safely make a subject of. There remains a third option, one my council did not prepare terms for, because they did not believe it would be necessary." "Alliance," Rao said. "Alliance," Sithris confirmed. "Conditional, cautious, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. Heavily monitored on our side for as long as it takes my council to understand what your species is capable of. But alliance, not annexation, not continued hostility. I will carry this recommendation to my Hive Council myself, and I will attach to it the incident report, the medical records, and my own testimony, because I do not believe any of my advisors will credit it secondhand." Marcus learned about the council's decision 3 weeks later, from a news broadcast playing in the medical bay's common room, in a segment that used his own service photo without asking permission and mispronounced his last name twice. In an unprecedented reversal, the Vashti Empire has formally withdrawn its annexation ultimatum against Earth and its colonies, offering instead a provisional alliance treaty centered on mutual technological exchange and joint border security in contested space. Sources within the Vashti delegation attribute the decision directly to an incident aboard Outpost Meridian, in which a station security officer intervened to save the life of Queen Regent Sithris during an assassination attempt. He turned the volume down before they got to his name a third time. The alliance was not, he would come to understand over the following months, a gift. It came with obligations humanity had not chosen and terms that would take years of negotiation to fully settle. Technology shared under careful restriction, human military assets subject to joint oversight in contested corridors, a Vashti observation presence on every major human world that some called protection and others called a leash with better manners. Nobody on either side pretended it was a friendship. It was, at best, a wary and closely watched partnership between two civilizations that had, 3 weeks earlier, expected to be at war. But it was not annexation. It was not the culling that Persephone had made everyone fear. And for a species that had, until 11 days before the delegation's arrival, been bracing for the worst outcome available, a wary partnership felt very close to a miracle. Cythris visited him one final time before her ship departed Meridian, standing in the same spot beside his bed where she had first asked her question. "My council has ratified the terms," she said. "It will not be simple. Some among them still believe the correct decision was annexation, and that I have made an error born of an isolated incident rather than a genuine pattern. I have told them I intend to find out which is true. I will be sending observers to your worlds. Scholars, not soldiers, though I understand your people may struggle to distinguish the two for some time. You could have just annexed us and skipped the trust-building exercise," Marcus said. "Would have been simpler." Simpler is not always correct. Cythris studied him with that six-eyed, unreadable focus he had almost, in 3 weeks, gotten used to. "I still do not fully understand why you did what you did. I am not certain you understand it either. But I have built an empire's foreign policy on the belief that the not understanding is worth preserving, rather than eliminating. I hope, Marcus Chen, that this proves to have been a wise decision, and not merely a sentimental one." "For what it's worth," Marcus said. "I hope so too." She left without further ceremony. The Vashti, he had learned, did not care for prolonged farewells, and the door closed behind her with a soft hydraulic hiss that felt, in that moment, disproportionately final. Marcus Chun did not become a diplomat or a symbol, or anything so tidy as the story the news feeds wanted him to be. He returned to duty on Meridian 8 weeks later, still favoring his left shoulder in cold weather, still uncomfortable with the small crowd of station personnel, who now nodded to him in corridors with an expression somewhere between gratitude and awe. He did not enjoy the attention. He asked, more than once, to be reassigned somewhere quieter, and was told, more than once, that Meridian needed him precisely because of what had happened there. He kept doing his job. He kept standing near walls at diplomatic functions, watching crowds instead of speeches, because old instincts did not disappear just because the story had a good ending. When new Vashti scholars arrived on rotation 18 months later, quiet, watchful, cataloging every human interaction with the patient thoroughness of a civilization determined to solve a puzzle it had accidentally uncovered, Marcus was occasionally asked to sit for interviews he never fully enjoyed and never quite refused either. He was asked, in nearly every one of those interviews, some version of the question Cythris had asked him from that hospital bed. "Why did you do it?" And in nearly every interview, his answer stayed close to the truth he had given her, unpolished by the retelling. There wasn't time to think. There was only a shape closer to danger than anyone who could stop it, and the plain, stubborn fact that doing nothing had never once felt like an option worth living with. It was not, by any measure, a complicated answer. But it was the one thing an empire built on 10,000 years of calculated consensus had never been able to model, and could not stop trying to understand. And in the space between what the Vashti could calculate and what one exhausted, unremarkable human being had simply done, an entire species found room to survive. Some nights, standing his post along Meridian's quiet outer ring, Marcus thought about Holloway. The 9 seconds, the choice that hadn't saved anyone, the years of feeling like the wrong call had followed him ever since. He did not think the second choice erased the first. That wasn't how any of it worked in his experience. But he had stopped waiting to feel like a hero because he understood now that heroism, if that was even the right word for what had happened in that atrium, had never been the point. The point, if there was one, was simpler than that. Someone had been in danger. He had been close enough to matter. He had moved. The end.